Okay, well, thanks very much for inviting me, and thanks so many people for coming, which is amazing. As mentioned, I'm going to talk to you about Marxist political economy today. I'll come back to that in a minute, but I'm very, very conscious of what brings us here, and I want to say something about that first, because although I'm going to talk about Marxist political economy, this, of course, is only one branch of political economy or heterodox economics, which is an alternative to the mainstream, and which is not any part of the curriculum of the teaching of economics. And I want to comment on this first, to try and explain why that should be so, in order to create a context within which we can understand why Marxist political economy and other versions of political economy or alternatives to the mainstream are absent or even vilified. So, first thing is to notice, I don't have any horns, and I'm not stupid, and I do know maths, and I do things which are relevant to the real world, etc., etc. I mean, the ways in which heterodoxy have been dismissed have been quite extraordinary. And even when I give talks like this, people ask me, do you adopt this position because you don't know maths or something like this? Or you've never done any policy work, all of which are just simply false. Well, I want to begin by saying something about why heterodox economics is absent from the curriculum. And here I want to point to four crucial elements of the mainstream, characteristics of mainstream economics. The first of all is that it has an extraordinary monopoly of the discipline, in the sense that almost every academic economist is committed to the mainstream. There are differences between them, particularly between Keynesians and non-Keynesians, for example. But it is the case that the mainstream has an extraordinary monopoly over the discipline. To some extent, it wasn't always so, but it has become so. This is even stronger within the UK than it is in the USA now, even though the origins of this monopoly do in fact derive from the United States. So that's the first thing to be aware of. The sorts of things I'm going to tell you today will never be debated. When I first started doing economics, it's over 40 years ago, they would have been debated by the mainstream. But now they've got such a monopoly, they do not have to engage in debate with alternatives at all. The second aspect of the mainstream that I want to emphasize is that it has no knowledge at all, really, institutionally, let alone individually, of its own history. The history of economic thought practically does not exist within the teaching of economics. I can't think of any other discipline in which this is true. Sociology, politics, philosophy. You will find that the history of the discipline is not only crucial as a part of the curriculum, it also continues to inform the ideas that are taught, debated, and so on. But if you go and ask your lecturers what do they know about the history of economic thought, it is as if it never existed, as if the discipline has no history of its own. In fact, it's become so difficult now that those who practice the history of economic thought, it's usually a set of white, middle-aged, nearing retirement individuals from some bygone era, actually say the only way we can survive is to, I'm not talking about John and me, the only way we can survive is by taking ourselves out of economics altogether and finding a place for ourselves in the history of science studies. Okay. So that's the second thing. The third thing is there is no methodology. There is no knowledge, debate, or understanding of methodology within mainstream economics. Again, this has got considerably worse over the time that I've been an economist. There used to be some crude attachment to positivism and empiricism and so on. But now, if you ask, is any methodology taught within economics? Do your lecturers, your professors even know anything about methodology, debates around methodology in the social sciences? And the answer is no. The one, perhaps I should say there are 5 things. The 3 that I've just given you, a monopoly. Well, the monopoly is itself indicative of the total absence and intolerance of alternative forms of thought. And this leads me now to my last and 4th point about the mainstream, is that it has absolutely no intellectual integrity whatsoever. Again, I don't know any other discipline in which this is true, but it's not just, in fact, in a way, the failure to debate with alternatives, or indeed the failure to acknowledge the presence of a real world which totally falsifies everything that underpins mainstream economics, is something which is simply set aside, ignored, and so on. And so the idea that economists are scholars in any sense other than counting the angels on the tip of a pin is, to me, quite wrong. So the idea that if you're going to study something, you should take a scholarly stance towards it, understand fully what others have to say on the issues, take that into account in your own intellectual endeavours, let alone in your teaching, is something which is totally alien to the profession of economics. I haven't got, still a long way to go till I get to Marxism, hang on. What I want to say is, first of all, to give a characteristic of this mainstream in a particular way, and then tell you something about the way in which the mainstream became the way that it is. And if you've done any economics, this is my characteristic of the mainstream as it is now. It is controversial within heterodox economists themselves, but I'm not going to give you those debates. I'm going to tell you what my view is. And my view is, and I think this will be familiar to anyone who has studied economics at any level, that really economics is organized around what I call TA squared. That is TA times TA. The first TA is the technical apparatus. And that technical apparatus, in a sort of couple of words, is very, very familiar. It's utility functions, U, and it's production functions. And nearly all economics starts from the idea of utility functions and production functions. And you play around with those within your models, whether it's micro or macro or anything else, or whether you refine it with all sorts of other assumptions. But really, at the core of the technical apparatus of mainstream economics is the utility function pertaining to an individual and the production function pertaining to a firm. So that's the technical apparatus. The technical architecture is the use of that technical apparatus on the basis of 3 things. One is the optimizing behavior of individuals. I mean, that is so central that, again, there can be departures from it, but the optimization of individuals around utility functions and production functions is essential. There's also a preoccupation with efficiency. What are the efficiency properties that come out of the models that we build? And the third element within the technical architecture is equilibrium. So here we have a technical apparatus on the one hand, organized around the optimizing behavior of individuals and looking at the efficiency properties or not of equilibrium. Okay, I want to now say something about how did this come about? How is it that mainstream economics is organized around this TA squared? And the answer really goes back to, initially, to the marginalist revolution of the 1870s. At this point, I usually pause and ask, who knows what the marginalist revolution of the 1870s is? Don't be shy. Who hasn't the slightest idea what I'm talking about? Well, perhaps you're not economists, I don't know. But this is indicative of one of the points I made earlier. The marginalist revolution of the 1870s is the process by which mainstream economics really got the concepts that it uses today. But of course, why would you know that? Because you don't know anything about the history of your own discipline. Before that, we had what was called classical political economy, associated with Smith, Mill, Ricardo, Marx, Malthus, and others. But particularly, I think, associated with someone called Marshall, the technical apparatus as we know it today, and the concepts we use, marginal utility, marginal productivity, consumer surplus, externalities, monopoly, and so on, these were all created by the Marxist revolution of the 1870s. And we can see the concepts there in their early forms. What I want to argue now is that the next 50 years, from the Marxist revolution to something called the formalist revolution of the 1950s, one small part of economics became preoccupied with one particular question. And that question is, given we've got this technical apparatus of utility functions and production functions, given we've got this assumption that individuals maximize their utility or maximize their profits, what are the maximum deductive implications that we can derive from this? What is it we can get out of this technical apparatus? Okay? And so that was a problem that is one problem amongst many. That's a problem that economics set itself in the 1870s, and eventually, believe it or not, they very elegantly and mathematically, sophisticatedly, funny word, solved that problem by the 1950s. But that's not what I'm interested in. I can tell you what, if you're an advanced economics student, you will know what the solution to those problems were. One is called the Slutsky-Samuelson conditions for optimization, and that's about the technical apparatus. What are the deductive implications that we can draw from the fact that individuals optimize or maximize profits? We can say something about the properties of demand functions or supply functions, and the other one was general equilibrium, which was put forward by Arrow and de Breuil. What is the implications for the workings of the system as a whole if every individual sets about optimizing subject to these conditions? I am interested in the technical results, but what I'm much more interested in for our purposes today is to ask, how did they get those technical results? What is the process by which they derive? Not the mathematics, but the conceptual and methodological process by which these maximum deductive implications were drawn out of the optimizing behavior of individuals and so on. And the answer is, in terms of what is the nature of the process, was that anything that possibly got in the way of obtaining those technical results was perceived as a barrier that should be thrown away. So, for example, fixed preferences. We all know, I can look around here and see straight away that not only have you different preferences amongst yourselves, but none of you have fixed preferences. They develop, change all the time through social influences and so on. The meaning of you as an individual, the meaning of goods to you, is not something that is fixed in a utility function. How are individuals identified? You don't even have to say anything about individuals or about the goods. All we have to do is give them symbols, because we have no account taken of the nature of individuals or the nature of goods, or indeed that we might have motives other than, I confess, I do not maximize my utility. I'm quite an altruistic person. I'm not being paid for coming here. It's taken me all day to get here and to go back again, etc. There's a tube strike when I get back, so I don't know how I'm going to get home. And so, you could reconstruct this as my own self-interest as, wishing to please you or something else. That's just then makes it a tautology. But the idea, the single motive we have is the maximization of utility, is purely nonsensical and defies our own reasoning. Okay? Similarly, the idea, as I said, that individuals or goods are fixed. All right? Anything in the way of obtaining those deductive implications is thrown out, whether it be realism, whether it be conceptualization of the individual or the economic process, whether it be the assumptions about individuals, whether it be methodology, did I say realism already, or whether that be similarly, you know, production functions. Technology is fixed. It's a pure relationship between inputs and outputs, as if this is not a process of human labour, inventiveness, changing the nature of goods through the production process, and so on. So the thing I really want to emphasize here is that in the passage from the marginalist revolution of the 1870s to the formalist revolution of the 1950s, the formalist revolution was a time after which economics became incredibly mathematical. Right? That's why it's called the formalist revolution. But in the passage from the 1870s to the 1950s, we have this extraordinary, what I call an implosion. Economics just turns in on itself and throws out anything in the way of its results. Got the idea? I hope that rings true. Okay, then something extraordinary happened. You see, we actually throw out all of these assumptions, which are necessary in order to get our results, and then over the next, from the formalist revolution to the present day, we have a process of actually explosion in the opposite direction. Oh, wait a minute, we've assumed that preferences are fixed, or we've assumed there's perfect competition, or we've assumed da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Now, having obtained this technical apparatus by throwing out all of these assumptions, we will start bringing them back in again, but examining them on the basis of what I will now call, because that's what they are, the microeconomic principles. So what we do is we obtained our microeconomic principles by this quite extraordinary process of implosion, having got them by making these extraordinarily unacceptable set of assumptions, which are totally alien to anyone once they start studying economics, but become conventional thinking once you've had a few terms and you want to pass your exams or go on further. Having obtained these outcomes, we then start deploying this technical apparatus to examine not only this very, very narrow, specialized form of behavior, but all economic phenomena. And subsequently as well, I haven't got time to talk about this, also to explain all social phenomena as well. So from the 1950s onwards, we get this process of having got these microeconomic principles, we then start, even though we've got them in the most bizarre way, we then start saying, oh, we can apply them to everything. But this was very, very weak to begin with. For the first 30 years, there was considerable resistance to this process of exploding across the discipline, and indeed across the social sciences more generally, for one very, very significant reason, and that was the presence of Keynesianism. Keynesianism was not based upon the optimizing behavior of individuals, on the idea of general equilibrium and so on. But then with the collapse of the post-war boom, the discrediting of Keynesianism, we then get the internal, if you like, almost like an internal colonization of the discipline by microeconomics. So macroeconomics becomes reduced to microeconomics, most notably with the new classical economics. And then even in the most bizarre and extreme form, which makes the original set of unacceptable assumptions almost seem acceptable, that all markets work efficiently, including financial markets, that the state is totally ineffective, that comes out of the purest forms of neoclassical economics, that we should study the economy on the basis of one representative individual for consumption and one representative individual for firms. I mean, how did this come about? What I've tried to do is explain that this is all part of a process which begins with the Marxist Revolution, which in the first phase reaches its fruition with the formalist revolution, and then, having got there, begins to expand across not only economics, but in something I call economics imperialism, across other social sciences as well. And that means economics now believes that it can explain everything: culture, habits, institutions, and so on the basis of this set of technical, this TA squared. Okay, that's by way of introduction of why we are here today. Because some of us, at least, I hope, have taken the view that maybe we shouldn't conform to this long-standing process of 150 years, which not only explains why economics is the way that it is, but why it should have become dominant, why it should become so extreme in its monopoly, lack of history of economic thought, methodology, and intellectual integrity. It's become this bundle of techniques which are perceived to be universally applicable. We can begin to modify as well. There's something, I mean, this is something I very strongly emphasize. Economics has extraordinary strength and weakness at the same time. Its strength rests in its monopoly of the discipline, its monopoly of the way in which economics should be done. On the other hand, particularly recently, and it's obviously been not dramatically in terms of developments within the discipline, but equally, economics has shown itself to be extraordinarily weak. Not because it couldn't explain the crisis, but because those principles, the TA squared, has shown itself to be incapable of explaining economic relations, functions, dynamics, and so on. And so economics has increasingly said, oh, we can't explain things, so we're going to have to look at institutions, or we're going to have to look at customs, or we're going to have to look at other behavioral types of assumptions. And that, in a sense, is a weakness. It's a weakness because it says our economic principles are not good enough. I'm not against interdisciplinarity, for example, but actually the way in which economics does this is on the basis of this irreducible TA squared that I referred to. So the great strength of economics, it's a strength I wish it didn't have, is its monopoly of the discipline. Its great weakness is, in a sense, a self-recognition of we're inadequate, we can't do the job. And that precedes the crisis itself. Okay, shall I turn to Marxist political economy now? I thought it would be good to say these things to begin with because it's about the nature of why we are here. And so let me talk about Marxist political economy now. This is a bit of self-advertising. Okay. If you want to know about Marxist political economy, what you should do is read Marx. Not listen to me, or read this book that I've co-authored, which is now in its 5th edition, which I first wrote in 1974. All right. When coming out of a course in Marxist economics that was being taught. I mean, that's more or less impossible now. There are many, many organizations dealing with heterodox alternatives. Perhaps the most prominent is the World Economic, what's it called? The World, I forgot what it's called, the World Alternative Economics. That's got more members than the AEA. But the one I'm particularly associated with is www. It's the International Initiative for the Promotion of Political Economy. If you go to that website, you'll be able to get 40% discount on the book as well. So there's a double advertisement and so on. Okay, so let me say something about Marxist political economy. This is a vast topic. You know, we could have a whole course on Marxist political economy. And so obviously I'm going to make a few pointers. The pointers I'm going to make are more concerned with presuming you don't know much about Marxist political economy, but also to try and stimulate interest within it and show that it has something to offer in order to understand the workings, particularly of a capitalist economy. And the first thing I want to say is that the concepts that Marx uses are historical. What Marx is concerned with is capital and capitalism. In this respect, Marx is not unique, but he is distinctive. Again here, perhaps it's helpful, like in my earlier remarks, it may be worthwhile drawing the distinction with mainstream economics in order to make it clear what I mean by Marx's concepts being historical. Because this is, for economists, this is totally unfamiliar. I just write down a production function. You know, that's what I do, and then I do my model and then I find my solution to it. Let me draw out this distinction by referring to a very, very famous, until history of economic thought went its miserable way, book by Lionel Robbins called an essay on the nature and significance of economic science, where Robbins, against the previous traditions and against much opposition at the time in the 1930s, I suspect most of you haven't heard of this because it's 1930s, you don't read anything that wasn't published before 2007. So, it's got lots of jokes about this book. Save this for later. And Robbins defines economics as the study of the scarce resources, the allocation of scarce resources between competing ends. Right? Now, what I want to point out is this is a totally ahistorical conceptualization of economics. Actually, in the first edition of this book, I say, this is something squirrels do. It's got nothing to do with human society. It's got nothing to do with a particular historical period. There's no rooting of the concepts that you use in the history or the society that you are studying. These are universally applicable. Right? So, the squirrel that decides whether to eat the acorn or save it for later is allocating scarce resources between competing ends. There's no concept within there that is not historic. That's not to say the theory itself doesn't have historical origins. Why was Robbins saying that when he did? That's not my point. My point is the concepts that he uses, like utility function, like production function, like optimization, like equilibrium, like efficiency, like optimization, these are all universally applicable not only to all societies, but to actually many other things as well, including squirrels. Perhaps I should move on to hedgehogs. Whereas for Marx, it's very, very important that the concepts that you use be rooted within and be applicable to the specific society under study. And for him, as you're probably aware, if you know anything about Marxism at all, the way in which he divided societies in order to identify the appropriate concepts to study them was by looking at what he called modes of production. And the vast majority of Marx's work and the vast majority, or certainly of his political economy, is concerned with capital and capitalism. So he wants to develop concepts which are particularly appropriate for understanding capitalism and capital, not treating capital and capitalism as something that is equivalent to a hibernating hedgehog, or indeed as something which is equivalent to feudalism, where again you could talk about the optimal properties of the system, optimization, efficiency, equilibrium, and so on. For Marx, again, as you're probably familiar if you know anything about Marx's political economy, modes of production, and in particular the capitalist mode of production, are associated with class relations. And it's really, if we want to study an economy, we've got to say something about the nature of its class relations. And in particular, the class relations within capitalism are ones in which there is one, a minority class, which owns the means of production, or capital. As a class, they exercise power over the production of goods and services and so on. Whereas those who actually undertake the production, the wage labour, it's not just that they undertake the wage labour and produce everything, but they do so in the form of wage labour. So for Marx, it's crucial that capitalism is based upon class relations within which there is the existence of wage labour. And so for Marx, wage labour is a relation which is essential to capitalism and through which a surplus is appropriated by a minority, those who directly or indirectly own the means of production. Okay, so that's the first point. So really, just to try and give you some, I've just examined my whole PhD thesis on this point. What is the historical nature of Marx's method, etc., etc. But basically it boils down to, if you want to understand capitalism, you've got to have something concepts which are specific to capitalism. For Marx, that involves class relations, and it also involves recognizing that capitalism is based upon wage labor, not labor in general, where you're trading off a disutility of work against the potential utility of the goods you can buy through that work. Is that okay? So far, so good? Next point. Marx was a very, very modest man, and he said, you know, quite rightly, it wasn't him that discovered the existence of classes. Everyone knew about classes in the old days. We still know about today, if we're honest, really. Although they may be more difficult to discern to some extent. So what Marx saw as his discovery was not the existence of class relations. Also, Marx did not suggest that his big discovery was the presence of exploitation. It's transparent as exploitation, isn't it? I mean, we all work, well, I don't know about you all, but we all work, and there are those out there who don't work, or pretend to work, you know, on their computers moving money about, and they get huge rewards and profits and things like this. Not a question, just stretching. Okay. So, again, the existence of exploitation, which for Marx was those working providing the surplus for those who do not work, was not, he thought, his particular discovery. So, although people tend to identify class and exploitation with Marx, quite rightly, but you know, Marx wasn't the person who discovered this. What is important and what is unique about Marx is the way in which he takes these insights forward. How is it that he understands both class and exploitation, particularly in what is obviously his most important work, the volume Capital? And here I want to refer to four things, one of which I've already referred to already. The first is that Marx has a definite structural understanding of society and of capitalism. And in particular, it's not just that there are classes and one exploits the other, but this takes place through a production process, in factories if you like, or in universities, or elsewhere, but it also takes place through exchange. What is characteristic, obviously, of a capitalist society is however production takes place, and whoever gets the surplus that comes from that production, it's actually realized, that's the word that's used, actually comes about through processes of exchange as well. So for Marx, there's a big structural division between the processes of production on the one hand, part of your structure, and the processes of exchange on the other hand. Okay. Got that? I've already said what is the second crucial characteristic of Marx, and that is his appeal, or his analysis of processes. Marx's theory of capitalism, again, shouldn't come as a surprise to you, is not about, let's find an equilibrium and investigate its efficiency properties. What for Marx is that capitalism and the capitalist economy is always in a process of reproducing itself, but also changing, as you go through the structures of production, followed by exchange, followed by production, followed by exchange, and so on. Okay? And then the third thing I want to talk about as being very highly characteristic of Marx is class relations. I've already mentioned that, but although we have this crude division between capital on the one hand and labour on the other hand, Marx, particularly in the later volumes of Capital, Volume 2 and Volume 3, neither of which he finally prepared for publication himself, as opposed to Volume 1, for Marx, class relations are fundamentally based on the relations between capital and labour on the other hand, but there are other agents within the production processes and in exchange as well, who undertake different functions for capital and different functions for labour in production. So there are merchants who buy and sell commodities. Right? There are foremen, if you like, in the production process. And also within the sphere of exchange, there will be those who buy and sell, borrow and lend in the processes of exchange itself, something which I will return to. So it's very important not to caricature Marx and seeing him as simply reducing the capitalist structures and processes as being capital versus labour, and that's all there is to it. He has a very, very sophisticated understanding of other functionaries, agents, processes in the production of capital. And then the fourth point, which is very, very important for Marx, and again I've referred to this in a sense in denying that it's about equilibrium, is that Marx's theory of capital and of capitalism is highly dynamic. And what he's concerned with is how is the surplus produced under capitalism? How is it that surplus gets produced under capitalism, as well as bought and sold and distributed and so on? And he's really interested, in particular, in a very, very narrow way, in how is the surplus produced under capitalism, in the process of production itself. How many of you have read Volume 1 of Capital? Shall I test you on it? Okay. The vast majority, the bulk of Volume 1 of Capital is actually about one question only. And that question is, how does capitalism produce a surplus? How does it literally do it in the production process itself? And Marx examines this in huge detail, in theoretical and empirical terms. And he comes up with the answer that one way in which you can produce more surplus is by extending the working day. Make people work longer. Or extending work to women and children. Or making the work more intensive. This is something called the production of absolute surplus value. And so for Marx, particularly when capitalism first establishes itself, there's not any great new revolution in the techniques of production, like in an industrial revolution. The first stages of capitalism are about the creation of wage labour and then getting workers to work more or longer or more intensively so that more surplus is generated. What Marx then also does is to look at another way of generating more surplus, and that is by increasing productivity. Because if we increase productivity, then either directly or indirectly in the production of wage goods, so for example, if we increase the productivity of food production, or if we increase the productivity of steel production, then cars and food become cheaper, and so the amount of labour time that is used in order to produce wage goods becomes less, and there's more surplus left over. And so what Marx argues is what he called the production of relative surplus value. The production of relative surplus value is something through productivity increase directly or indirectly in wage goods, is something which is uniquely characteristic of capitalism in the way that it revolutionizes, is the word he uses, the methods of production themselves. And I could go through again a huge amount of theoretical and empirical work that Marx employs in the first volume of Capital to see the nature of the way in which productivity increase is specifically developed within capitalism. And he comes up with the idea of how important this is for a factory system, but equally important is his conclusion that capitalism is a system that can only survive if it continues to accumulate capital. And this is, in many ways, a competitive process between capitalists. Because if you're going to increase productivity, what is increasing? This is a good example to use for reasons which will become clear later. If you're going to increase productivity, produce more of these desks, then what does that mean? What that means is you take all the raw materials in there, hard to identify what they are now, but you take all the raw materials which are in there, and a given amount of labour will work up more and more raw materials into final products. So that's what productivity increases specifically under capitalism. There are other ways of having productivity increase, through new products, through your new inputs and so on, but the only one we can look at systematically is creating more output out of given raw materials. But if a capitalist is going to do that, there's two things they need. First of all, they need a lot more raw materials, because in a given day's work, you have to have a lot of raw materials for those workers to work upon. And secondly, the way you do that is increasingly displacing the worker, displacing the strength of the worker, displacing the tools of the worker, and putting them into machinery. Right? And so that's why Marx has a theoretical and empirical analysis of the development of the factory system as the method of production which is most characteristic of advanced capitalism. And